Hello and welcome to the Can't Make This Up History podcast. I'm your host Kevin and I'm very glad to have you with me today. Well, we are all familiar with the story of the Holocaust and the mass genocide committed by the Third Reich. What you may never have heard of, however, is the story of the Polish patriot Witold Pilecki, who volunteered to enter the Auschwitz concentration camp as a prisoner in order to observe and report on the atrocities he witnessed. My guest today is Jack Fairweather, a journalist and former war correspondent whose new book, The Volunteer, One Man, an Underground Army, and the Secret Mission to Destroy Auschwitz, shines a light on Witold Pilecki's first-hand reporting that had previously been hidden in Soviet Union archives for decades. Before we get started, I just want to give a word to those who like to listen to the show with little ears around. You may want to consider putting on a different episode and coming back to this one later. Since we are talking about the Holocaust today, the conversation does get a little grim and graphic at times. Lastly, I'd like to invite you to help me with the show. We don't do any kind of advertising here at the Can't Make This Up History podcast, so the way we build the audience is all word of mouth. If you can spare a few seconds, please open your Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or whatever app you're using to listen to this and give the show a positive rating. If you're feeling really ambitious, you can even leave a review and share what you like about the show. I'd love to give your review a shout out on a future episode. Alright, now let's dive into The Volunteer with Jack Fairweather.
The You Can't Make This Up History Podcast, bringing you strange but true things from the past. It's not the average history that you learned in school. We're bringing you the heroes and bringing you the fools. Them stories that are just too crazy to believe. The stranger than fiction and super unique.
Hello, Jack Fairweather. Welcome.
Hi, Kevin.
How are you today, sir?
I'm very good. And yourself?
Doing quite well. Thank you. Thank you for coming on today. If you could, tell us a little bit about yourself. As I understand it, you have a long career as a war correspondent, correct?
That's right. I reported from Iraq and Afghanistan for the best part of a decade for the Daily Telegraph and then the Washington Post.
All right, and you are the author of a new book that we're going to talk about today called The Volunteer, One Man, an Underground Army, and the Secret Mission to Destroy Auschwitz. How did you discover this story?
I had just left the Middle East and was mulling over my experiences there when I bumped into another war reporter friend, and he, by coincidence, had just come back from a reporting assignment to Auschwitz. It was an anniversary story, and he'd learned there about a resistance cell in the camp. And the very idea that there could be resistance in Auschwitz was completely shocking to me. I thought of the camp, I think many people do, as this place of just mass slaughter, and it seemed such a shocking new idea that I knew I had to find out more. And a year or two later, Witold Pilecki, the hero of my book, one of his reports was finally translated into English, and it was just so compelling and captivating, yet filled with gaps, and it seemed like a mystery that needed to be explored.
Well, I'm glad that you did explore this, because this was a very fascinating book to read. I was not familiar with Witold Pilecki's story at all, and the idea that someone would volunteer to go to Auschwitz is truly unbelievable.
It is mind-boggling. You're right, Pilecki was a volunteer. When he began his mission, Auschwitz had only just opened. This is in the summer of 1940, less than a year into the war. And the camp was originally opened by the Germans as a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners. So that's one thing I had to learn in approaching the story, that it wasn't initially a place for extermination of Jews. In fact, the Nazis didn't have an idea about mass extermination at that stage. It was a camp for Polish political prisoners. It was still a place of incredible brutality, and those were the rumors that were reaching the underground in Warsaw and made the resistance there think we need to send someone in there to find out more, to organize a resistance and, stage a breakout or an uprising, certainly send us information that we can pass on to the Allies about what's happening in the camp. So they turned to Pilecki. He was 39 years old. He was a farmer. He was a member of the Polish Reserve Forces. He probably would not have become one of World War II's most extraordinary heroes, but for the invasion of Nazi Germany. And this pushed him into this path, the resistance in Warsaw initially, and then presented with this extraordinary challenge.
Yeah, let's back up a little bit and talk about his background before getting to the camp. What can you tell us about Witold's patriotism and his experience in the face of the Nazi blitzkrieg against Poland?
Yeah, he was one of those Polish soldiers who, as mobilization was sounded across Poland, took to his horse like other members of the military. It seems rather extraordinary to think of, but he rode into battle and came up against the blitzkrieg a couple of hundred miles from the German-Polish border, and his men were completely decimated in half an hour of encountering the German tanks. Other units along the Polish defenses did not fare well, and Pilecki was left scrambling desperately back to Warsaw as the Germans broke through Polish lines. And it was a story repeated, across the different fronts of the German invasion, and the Poles capitulated in a few weeks. In fact, it reminded me in thinking about it of the American military versus the Iraqis that I had personally experienced. It was a huge mismatch of firepower. Pilecki carried on in the woods as a sort of guerrilla fighter for a while, but ultimately he realized that the war was lost, and he and some of his men headed towards Warsaw in November, a couple of months into the war, to begin the resistance.
You get the sense as you write that he at no point gives up, but he starts thinking long term, and he starts organizing the underground as a subversive organization. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so let's just picture the scene. I mean, this is in Warsaw. The city is devastated by the war, huge piles of rubble everywhere. People are starving on the streets. The Germans have begun deporting tens of thousands of Polish citizens from areas they had annexed directly to the Reich, and they were turning up in Warsaw on cattle trucks, frozen. Disease was rampant. There was not much food. It was one of the coldest winters in living memory. Pilecki met up with a small group in an apartment one night and said, "We are going to fight until death to overcome the Germans." Now, of course, there was a huge mismatch between Pilecki and his small group and the power and the scale of the German occupation. But they started reaching out. Pilecki was a recruiter. It was obviously a real skill that he had from the beginning, just this ability to connect with people, to make the right judgment as to who could join the underground. And they started to grow. Other groups sprung up around the city, and bit by bit, the underground began to form this quite cohesive organization that was able to, I think in the first instance, just tell other Poles that, we can fight back against the Germans. Don't give up hope. They were able to provide help and assistance to each other. And they also started organizing. At that stage of the war, they were waiting for the big showdown, what they thought would be the big showdown between Germany and Britain and France. And they wanted to time any operations or actions for when that battle resumed the Western Front. And of course, it was a very devastating blow for every Pole when the German blitzkrieg just rolled through Western Europe and France surrendered. The Brits were evacuated from Dunkirk, and suddenly Hitler was even more powerful and in control of continental Europe. That's when the focus of the underground started to shift more towards intelligence gathering. They realized that this war was going to go on for a long time, and what they needed to do was keep telling the Allies what was happening in Poland, keep the attention on Poland, and in a bid to bring resources and bring assistance to the country. Otherwise, they would just get lost in the general tumult of the war. And that was the sort of background towards the underground leadership thinking about Auschwitz, this new concentration camp, this place of great brutality that they wanted to find out more about, because they hoped that by sending Pilecki there, he would send them a report that could be then passed on to the Brits, and it could sort of raise awareness and maybe lead to some form of intervention. And Pilecki by that stage had proven himself to be a very talented recruiter in the underground, and he seemed like the man for the job.
You touched on one of his assets. He really needed to be a good judge of character, didn't he?
He really did. I mean, it was a feature of Nazi rule that they were trying to break down the bonds of what made Polish society cohesive. They were pitting ethnic Catholic Poles against Jews, ethnic German citizens of Poland against Catholic Poles, and they were trying to create a racial hierarchy, which classic divide and rule situation, and that's something Pilecki felt very strongly about. He really pushed for the underground to be as inclusive as possible, to remind people of the bonds that connected them, and that's why I think in some extent he was a good recruiter, because he found ways to connect with people at this basic level, appealing to their patriotism, appealing to their sense of being Polish, but also just giving them his trust. In this time of turmoil where families were being sort of paid to inform on one another, the Gestapo were getting their grips into society. The ability of Pilecki to go against that grain was very powerful, and it was what allowed him in some ways to begin his work in Auschwitz when he got there.
Well, whether he wanted to be or not, he found himself becoming an intelligence operative, a spy essentially. So how and when did he decide to volunteer to go undercover into Auschwitz?
So in that summer of 1940, when the Auschwitz opened, the underground turned to him and proposed the operation to him. The idea was that he would infiltrate the camp by walking into a German roundup. So there'd been a big crackdown in Warsaw, in which the Gestapo and SS were dragging military-age men off the streets and sending a good number to Auschwitz. Others were going to forced labor. Some were getting shot. And, the idea was, here was a way to enter Auschwitz as a prisoner. Now, of course, it was a somewhat risky idea. I mean, who knows what would happen during a roundup? Often in these situations, Poles were just summarily executed there and then. Pilecki knew it was an extremely dangerous mission. And of course, not just for himself, but for his family. His family had moved from their home in eastern Poland, which was occupied by the Soviet Union at that point, and were living outside Warsaw at his mother-in-law's house, and they would be in danger. So Pilecki, his informants told him there was a big roundup planned in August of 1940, and he missed it as he dwelt on this really difficult mission. And it wasn't until September that he was ready, that he informed the underground, I'm going to do this mission. He had adopted an alias, so his name was disguised, and that gave a little protection to his family. Some of his close friends by that point had been caught elsewhere and sent to Auschwitz, so there was a sort of personal connection to the camp. But I think above all, it was just, here was a mission that had to be done. He wasn't a guy to sort of pass the buck on to someone else. They had turned to him to do the job, and he was ready to do it.
And at this point, he gets rounded up, as he intended. And what does he quickly discover about camp life there in Auschwitz?
Well, let's just dwell on that moment one more. I mean, he realized that the roundup was going to be in the Zolibor district of Warsaw, which happened to be where his sister-in-law and her 3-year-old nephew lived. And so the night before the scheduled roundup, he went to stay with them. And the next morning, pre-dawn, there was a bang on the door. It was the building caretaker announcing that the Germans had blocked off the streets and were taking men from the apartments. Of course, Pilecki knew that. In fact, he was already dressed and ready. There were shouts and gunshots from the streets. So then the Germans were in the stairwell of the apartment. Pilecki turned at this point to his 3-year-old nephew, whose teddy bear had fallen on the floor, which he picked up and gave to him, which was just one of those moments that really spoke to me about how Pilecki was able to reach beyond himself in these moments of crisis. Just when you think he should be, all wrapped up in his own nerves, he found that sort of quality within him to think about the 3-year-old boy. And the door burst open, and he stepped into captivity. And 3 days later, he arrived in Auschwitz. Describes it in his later report, the arrival. And he says it was like leaving the known world behind and entering just a whole new dimension. And the cattle cart arrived about 10 p.m. in the evening. The doors were thrown open, and prisoners were dragged from the carts, beaten and punched on the ground. Pilecki describes how 10 prisoners were lined up and shot right there and then, who were forced through the gates into the roll call square, then to be stripped and shaved and given numbers instead of names. And Pilecki quickly realized in the next few days that just surviving in the camp was going to be the first challenge. Prisoners were made to work these very hard labor details on starvation rations, constantly in danger of breaking the many rules of the camp and being beaten. There were dozens who died each day, and their bodies were dragged at the evening roll call over to the crematorium to be burnt. It was a truly grim, terrifying experience. And, it makes Pilecki's ability to look within himself and realize that he had to start fighting back all the more extraordinary.
When he first arrives in Auschwitz, his focus is on surviving. But it's not long before he starts organizing a resistance cell within the camp. How did he go about building that network?
So one of the things I was able to find in the research was this extraordinary testimony by a prisoner who describes the scene when Pilecki came up to him one evening very early into his time in the camp to recruit him. And I love this scene, not least because it's so rare to find, the act of recruiting captured in a testimony, but also because there was a certain truth to it. Pilecki went up to him, took him away from the group, and told him about the underground. And the other prisoner, this young 27-year-old man, looked at him and said, "Are you nuts? Just look at us. We are battered and bruised, starving. We are in no position to resist." But then something extraordinary happens that I think it sort of captures the secret of the underground. And that was that this young man, his name was Con, began to see that Pilecki, entrusting him with the secret of the underground, was really trusting him with the secret of his life. Con could have just walked over to one of the prisoner functionaries who ran the camp, or an SS guard, and say, "Oi, this guy's causing trouble," and have gotten a loaf of bread or, some special dispensation. But he didn't, because he realized that act of trust by Pilecki showed that something greater than themselves could exist in the camp. And that was, in fact, more precious to him, than a loaf of bread. And it's an extraordinary fact, actually, that, for Pilecki's 2.5 years in the underground, which grew and developed many men by the time he left the camp, there is no evidence that I discovered of any one of those recruits denouncing him or turning against him. That speaks again to this judgment that he had and those that he chose. But I think it also speaks to the fact that prisoners, no matter how, in this very dark moment in their lives, in a very dark moment in human history, needed more than ever the sort of ideals that Pilecki offered them through the underground.
Well, right. Every time he approaches somebody new, there's the risk, like you said, we'll just run off and report something to get some food.
He for sure has that concern, and later on, the SS did twig that the scale of the underground, and did begin inserting plants and spies.
Because they were somewhat aware of it, right?
Yeah, I mean, they felt in the beginning that, from their experience of other camps, that there would be prisoner gangs, and they couldn't conceive of the Poles, these Untermensch, these subhumans, being able to aspire to some grand resistance. They just figured that they were stealing food and bartering in the square. So they didn't take it seriously, which suited Pilecki just fine, as he began to turn the tables on them and really start his sabotage operations.
So as you mentioned before, the primary mission was really to observe and get the word out. And so what can you tell us about the reports that the underground began producing and smuggling them to London?
Pilecki's primary mission in going to the camp was to try and report on what was happening there. Of course, that presented him with this huge challenge. How do you get a message out of Auschwitz? Escape was incredibly difficult. They were constantly guarded. And what was more, any attempt led to reprisals against every prisoner in the camp, these terrible standing roll calls that could last for 24 hours, very, very brutal. And, Pilecki realized he didn't want to expose other prisoners to that. So he kept his eye out and realized that very rarely a prisoner would be released if their families paid the right bribes in Warsaw. And he found one prisoner and approached him through one of his men and recruited him and gave him an oral message to take to the underground. And it was truly one of those sort of goosebump moments during the research when my translator called me up from London and said, "Jack, I found Pilecki's reports, which had believed to have long been lost, but she had found it in a London archive, and it was the words that Pilecki told that prisoner to take to Warsaw, which were then smuggled across occupied Europe all the way to London. And the message itself was pretty extraordinary. And this is what Pilecki had to say in October 1940. He said, "Please, Polish government, allies, for the love of God, bomb this camp. even if it means killing everyone in it, because that will be worth it. What's happening here is so off the charts.
That is incredible.
And it's really one of history's great might-have-beens when you think about it. This is in 1940, years before the Holocaust and the full scale of the extermination practices of the Nazis came into effect in the camp. 1 million of the camp's victims were still alive. And, what would have happened had the Allies taken action at that stage?
And as we know from history, the camps were not attacked by the Royal Air Force, and understandably, that would have been a very difficult mission for them to pull off.
It was an incredibly difficult mission in that winter of 1940. I mean, the Brits were at that stage under all-out assault, known as the Blitz, when Hitler ordered cities across the country to be bombed and infrastructure, and the RAF's own bomber fleet was down from about 290 planes to a little over 100, and bombing in Germany was, it's worth just thinking about this for a moment. They did not have radar, so they had to fly and find their targets by eyesight. So that meant they could only fly on moonlit nights, and they rarely hit anything that they intended to hit. In fact, they developed this protocol of simply dropping their bombs out the doors after they thought they'd flown long enough to reach their target and then returned again. So it would have been incredibly hard to hit Auschwitz, which was at the furthest limit of what their aircraft could reach at that stage. But I think what it could have done, would have been to establish at a very early point in the war the principle of retaliation for humanitarian crimes by the Nazis. And it may be that they didn't hit Auschwitz, or they only caused minor damage, but they would doctrine, as it were, for taking action that I think could have really led to the destruction of Auschwitz over time as the British capabilities built up and the Americans entered the war. But that didn't happen. The Brits judged that Auschwitz was too risky, and they needed to focus on bombing targets as best they could in Germany.
So that left Witold to continue organizing and continue reporting. His network within the camp grew. How extensive did it become?
So, Pilecki had no idea the decision-making of the RAF headquarters. He would have sort of guessed that there were issues because there was no immediate response to his reporting, but he kept on reporting, kept on expanding the underground.
It's worth noting they don't know what's going on really in the broader war, do they?
They managed to steal a radio and set it up secretly in this makeshift camp hospital. So at night, when the SS guards have gone to their posts or have left the camp, they get to tune in to the BBC and catch up on the war's events. So they had some sense of the broader war and that it wasn't going very well for the Allies. But it's also the case that they were very isolated beyond a few bulletins and what new arrivals could tell them. So Pilecki was operating in something of a vacuum. He never got a message directly from the Warsaw Underground acknowledging what he was up to, but he had his head down. He was working around the clock, thinking out how to expand the underground, how to keep reporting, how to really figure out what the Nazis were up to. Because whilst the camp had begun as this internment facility for Polish political prisoners, it began to change over the course of 1941, and it also began to darken and become increasingly violent as the Nazi leadership in the camp responded to some of the issues that the terrible conditions in the camp had created. So what happened was that the numbers of sick prisoners in the camp just kept expanding. I mean, they weren't getting enough food, there was disease, there was the outbreak of typhus. And so the camp authorities began experimenting with different methods of euthanizing sick prisoners. And this was, in some ways, the first step towards mass murder in Auschwitz. There were similar experiments happening in other concentration camps, but there was always something particularly aggressive and innovative in what the SS in Auschwitz were doing. And in that summer of 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. A huge turning point in the war, and actually a huge turning point in Auschwitz's history, because Himmler, the SS chief, signed an agreement with the German Wehrmacht to bring 100,000 Soviet POWs to Auschwitz. In a flash, transforming potentially the complexion of the camp. And it also presented a challenge for the SS, because they had decided that they needed to weed out any possible communist agents among the prisoners. So what that meant was finding means to start killing a lot of Soviet POWs quickly. And this collided with this euthanasia program of sick prisoners that summer. And that was the summer in which the Nazis created the first gas chamber in Auschwitz, not for Jewish families, that was to come, but as a means to quickly kill sick prisoners and Soviet POWs. And Pilecki, I mean, he's right there watching all of this. He's trying to figure it out. He's trying to report on what's happening. That first gassing was done 100 yards from him, from every prisoner in the camp. It was in one of the basements, and 256 prisoners were dragged into the rooms there. 600 odd Soviet POWs showed up that evening and were led also into the basement. And then the SS men dropped pellets of Zyklon B gas, which was a pesticide used for killing lice in the camp, but was also highly toxic. And the prisoners, the testimonies that I came across are really some of the most harrowing I think I've ever read. Just describing the screams of the dying men. The SS hadn't used enough Zyklon B. This is again one of those experiments, that they had yet to perfect their killing, and so they had to go back in with more Zyklon B as these men were dying and gasping around them. And it wasn't until almost 24 hours passed that they could be sure that everyone was dead. And then the prisoner nurses who worked in the makeshift camp hospital had to drag the bodies all the way through the camp to the crematorium, 800 bodies to be burnt. And, Pilecki heard those screams and realized that something new and terrible had happened in the camp. And that's what he had to figure out exactly what, and then he had to get that message to Warsaw.
Yeah, and at one point in the book, you write about the workers who had been charged with carrying out these executions in such mass numbers, and also disposing of the bodies after they were finished. And you write about them eventually committing suicide due to all the horrors that they had seen. Even reading this just as a secondhand spectator, I mean, the book is excellent, and I'm very glad to have read it. But I'll admit that it was emotionally difficult to read. And so I'm wondering, how challenging was this for you to write?
Um, it, it it was challenging, and I think, like a lot of your listeners, I had struggled with the Holocaust, I guess, throughout my life. As soon as I heard about it at school, it's, this great act of evil that exists, it's there, but how do you get your head around it? And I think whenever I struggled with the material, it was Pilecki and his story that would drag me out of the doldrums. He is such a sort of blaze of light through the camp. His courage and heroism, that it sort of drags you through. You're not seeing the murder from the eyes of the victims. You're seeing it through this really remarkable perspective that was so fresh to me, that through the eyes of this protagonist who was there to take down the camp. And so whilst he is witnessing these horrific acts of mass murder, he is at the same time coming up with schemes to assassinate SS officers, to set up a radio station in the camp to broadcast messages out there. He's organizing some incredible escapes. At a certain point, he decides that they just need to get reports out there because what's happening is so extreme, and that's worth the danger of an escape. And so he comes up with increasingly ingenious methods to get his messengers out of the camp. So he's this problem-solving, ingenious, brilliantly subversive figure that, for me, helped me through the camp. He was my guide. And I guess in the same way that I was describing how Con, that prisoner, was recruited and made to realize that something through that Pilecki's act of trust was made to realize that something greater could endure in the camp. I felt it too. The Auschwitz was the place where the very worst that man can do to man occurred. But to my surprise, to my shock, it was also the place where some of the greatest acts of heroism took place. And I think that's ultimately how I got through writing the book.
So how long does it take Witold to put together exactly what the Nazis are doing? That it's really an industrial scale racial and ethnic genocide, and how long does it take him to get that information to the Allies?
So he struggled a bit to get his head around the Holocaust. I mean, it's easy now for us with the benefit of history to understand it, but this was something quite unprecedented in human history, industrialized mass murder. And Pilecki, it took him a while to figure out what the Nazis were up to, or rather, he understood what they were up to, but to understand the logic, like what was making them kill so many people. And he initially thought his one of his first messengers from the camp bearing news of the Holocaust, he told him that it must be because the Jewish families were being brought to the camp to be killed because the Nazis wanted to steal their gold and jewels that they were bringing to fund the war effort, which it was true. I mean, the Nazis were taking the belongings of those they murdered and sending them to the Reich, and that did include money and precious items. But of course, that wasn't why the Nazis were killing Jewish families. And he kept pushing away at it, and eventually he did understand. He did get his head around the act of genocide. Of course, he didn't have the word that we have, the Holocaust, to describe it. In his reports, he just called it a new nightmare, which I think certainly does capture, from Pilecki's perspective, what was happening. So over that summer, of 42, as Jewish families start to arrive on this massive scale to a satellite camp to Auschwitz called Birkenau. It was about 2 miles away, where there was dedicated gas chambers, and Jewish families were separated between workers who were registered in the main camp and the children and the elderly, who were led immediately to be gassed. Pilecki got his head around what was happening, and that was the point at which he organized one of the most amazing escapes in the camp's history. I think probably any concentration camp's history. 4 prisoners, including his courier, broke into an SS warehouse during a lunch break, dressed in SS uniforms that were stored there, then walked over to the garage of Commandant Hirsch, took one of his cars, and dressed as SS men just drove out of the camp gate. And they saw the deputy commandant riding by on his horse and struck him a Heil Hitler. He Heil Hitler back, and off they went. And Pilecki describes the scene that evening as that deputy commandant realizes that 4 men are missing, and that indeed he had actually seen them and saluted them. He threw his cap down and started swearing, and then burst into a sort of cackle of laughter. Pilecki, of course, enjoyed the moment immensely, and I think it's part of what I found so fascinating about the book is that you have this horrific act that's taking place, and then you have this just brilliance of Pilecki and other prisoners in taking risks to expose it. And I think what I also found just captivating about this research was it turned out that one of those escapers who had dressed as in the SS uniform was still alive, and I got to meet him. He was 96 years old, living in Gdansk, Poland, and I met him, and he told me the story of his escape in the most amazing detail. And it's amazingly moving to hear people talk about Pilecki who knew him and talk about these great acts of daring do. This prisoner, Kazimierz Piechowski, he died 6 months later, so I got to be one of his very last interviews, and it was very poignant, and actually he was able to identify who Pilecki's messenger was, and at the point at which in the escape group, and the point at which he left them to go and talk to the underground leadership in Warsaw, and that allowed me to then track down the report, one of these missing reports, and to really show what Pilecki was thinking about, what he was trying to achieve in the camp.
What a remarkable privilege for you to be able to meet one of the survivors and hear their stories about Witold.
It happened so many times. I mean, that generation in the 80s and 90s, I mean, they could not talk about Pilecki during the communist era for reasons I think we'll go on to talk about. So in many cases, I was talking to them and they were answering my questions about Pilecki for the first time. And I took, for example, Pilecki's nephew. He was the boy who was in the apartment when Pilecki volunteered. He was 3 years old at the time. He's in his mid-80s now. I met up with him, took him back to that apartment where Pilecki volunteered for his mission. It's the first time he'd been back in 80 years because the communists had taken the apartment over at the end of the war. And the act of being back in that place brought back the memory of that teddy bear on the floor. That's not in any book. That was just that moment, having Marek, is his name, Marek, back in that space and just talking through his memories. He was only 3, but he remembered that teddy bear, and he remembered that, the fear of that morning. And I got to speak to 20 plus folk who are still alive with these sort of memories, and wherever possible, they would come with me to the places in the story that still exist, like the apartment, like the safe house that Pilecki escaped to at the end of his time in the camp. And they shared with me what they could remember, and really allowed me to follow in Pilecki's footsteps, which seemed really important to me, both in a way, I think, as a biographer, you want to get as close as possible to your subject. But in the case of Pilecki, when his writings are somewhat patchy and there are big gaps, when he wrote after the war about his experiences, there were things he chose not to write about because he didn't want to expose his friends to danger of the communist regime. So following in his footsteps was really a way to find and discover elements of his story that you might miss otherwise. And it became a very touching experience, in terms of recreating his footsteps and finding families who would remember Pilecki. I recreated Pilecki's escape from the camp, and he names a few of the villages he stayed in, and I visited those villages and found these 80-plus-year-old men and women who were like, oh yeah, I was a kid, but I remember when Pilecki came and stayed with my family after escaping from the camp. And they would then describe how the family gave them sheltered them. And, it's just one of those moments when you're hearing about Pilecki being sheltered and given food and tea by the family, and you yourself are sitting there in the same room, in the same house with the same people, also being given tea and cake, as is the delightful way of Polish hospitality, and shadowing your subject. So it was very. By the end of the research, I felt that I had gained some insights into Pilecki, and I also felt this just a huge support and huge desire from those I'd spoken to really tell his story in a way that hadn't been done before.
Well, that's what I think is one of the strengths of your book, is it's really on the ground level, and it's not very far removed from those first-person accounts at all.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of incredible histories of the Holocaust and about Auschwitz that I, of course, had to turn to in the writing of the book. My aim wasn't to sort of write another history book. I felt that Pilecki's story was, one that had been hidden for decades, that the communists had deliberately suppressed, and it was a story that would benefit, that really needed to be told from Pilecki's experience, because Pilecki was a witness to the steps by which the Nazis reached the final solution in Auschwitz. And he was the first guy in the camp in subsequent history to really piece together those steps. And so whilst I wanted to tell Pilecki's personal journey, there is this, very important historical dimension to what he was doing, that, that personal story, that historical importance, lost. And that's why it needed to be told.
My last question for you is what has been the legacy of what he did? What's been the history of the Witold Report?
So, briefly, Pilecki escaped the camp. I think your listeners will just love that story. It's as dramatic as anything else in the book, and one in which I, very closely reported it. And I think you will feel like you yourself are escaping the camp. Pilecki went on to then try his best to rally a force to attack Auschwitz from the outside, and he turned first to those around the camp, and then he went to Warsaw, and he could not get anyone to really buy into his scheme. And one of the reasons for that was that the war was changing at this point, and the Soviets were rapidly rolling back the Germans, and the Soviets seemed like they were about to occupy Poland, and that then became the main focus of the underground. At that stage was not German crimes, but the very real threat of that the Soviets posed. And Pilecki gets sucked into the Warsaw Uprising, this huge battle in the final days of the German occupation, and he ends up in a German prisoner of war camp once again. But by the end of the war, Poland is occupied by the Soviets. Pilecki goes back to fight against them once again, creating an intelligence gathering operation to try and inform the Allies about communist crimes in the country. This time he is captured and put on a show trial. It was tough to write about, when you think about this guy who had risked so much to try and save so many lives, and yet here he is being brutally tortured and being called an enemy of the state and a traitor. And he is ultimately executed. And the reason why you haven't heard about Pilecki is that all of his reports that survived were locked away in the communist archives. The communists did not want his story out there. They did not want his inspirational story spreading and creating trouble for them. So really wasn't until the 90s that when the Iron Curtain fell and the archives opened up that the family and scholars were able to get to grips with Pilecki's exploits. In terms of legacy of Witold's reports, my hope is that this book will really establish the historical importance of what he was doing in the camp by showing for the first time how he was able to live report on the Holocaust from Auschwitz. Really extraordinary stuff. But I think his legacy goes beyond that in some ways. I mean, his legacy is this story of standing up to the greatest evil that mankind has ever perpetrated and finding a way to resist. And, I think that's a message and a legacy that we can always turn to, that we need now, perhaps more than at any point in the last few decades. How do you keep your moral compass in a world that's changing around you? And Pilecki provides the answer to that. His reports provide the answer to that. And it was really my great sort of privilege to be able to spend 3-4 years with him and trying to present his story for a wider audience.
Well, Jack, thank you for a fascinating and powerful discussion today. If someone wanted to read this inspiring story or wanted to learn more, where can they go?
They can go to their local bookseller, I hope, and ask for the book. Of course, it is available with Amazon and other online retailers, but I always encourage people to turn to their local bookstores as a way to support writers like myself.
All right. Well, Jack, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast today.
Thanks, Kevin. It's a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you to my guest, Jack Fairweather, for coming on the program today, and thank you for listening. If you would like to learn more about Jack's book, The Volunteer, check out the link in the description of this episode in your podcast app. And then if you would like to check out some supplemental content, head on over to the show notes for this episode at www.cmtuhistory.com. All right, that's a wrap for this episode. I will see you guys back here in 3 weeks on October 1st for our very first ever Patrons Pick episode. I have handed over the programming reins to the show's Patreon patrons, and they have decided who's going to come on the show, and they definitely made a good choice. I'm really looking forward to it and can't wait. I'll see you then.